So good to see everyone here this morning. We have some families coming in, some families going out, and we have that I want, especially for Ryan Brooks coming in. Good to see you there. My goodness, I saw him this morning, and he has grown up and filled out, and he's not a little boy anymore. And of course, you've been here before, but just so good to see you, along with other family members here that we have. We're in Romans chapter 6, and turn to Romans chapter 6. We're talking about the Roman road, going through the book of Romans as we continue on. And as we study the book of Romans, we apply it to our life and what we must do to live the Christian life and the things that Paul talks about. And he talks about four divisions in the book of Romans. He says the wrath of God. And we talked about the wrath of God, and Nick in his class this morning talked about the wrath of God and God being the judge and we deserving that wrath. But that wrath has been appeased by the propitiation, which is our Savior. And it is, as we talk about the wrath of God and the grace of God, and our reading this morning as we talk about the grace of God ended with, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." Romans 6, verse 14. We are who we are only by the grace of God. We do what we do only by the grace of God. We shall be what we shall be only by the grace of God. And it is. But it is, as we go and spread the good news, the gospel, we know that there are those who it just seems like we go up against the brick wall sometimes when we talk about salvation and the grace of God and the gift of God. And for the last couple of Sundays, we've talked about this particular chart. The church membership has been in decline from 1940 to 2020, especially since the year 2000. That it just seems that it's just a dramatic decline in people having an interest in salvation or God or the Bible or church or religion or anything associated with that. And we don't understand the grace of God if we are in this decline, because if we understood it, we would be going upward instead of downward. And there's so much in this church membership from 1940. We see this great, I'm going to step over here just a minute. 73% of those in the United States were attending church regularly. When I was growing up, when most of you were growing up, there were 7 out of 10 attending. Since 2000, we go from 70% down to 47% now. It's just remarkably, in the last 20 years, about half now in church attendance. That's in church membership. Here's church attendance. In church attendance, from 1993, we start with about 45%, and we go up, and we come down, up a little bit, and down 29% now in church attendance. That's 3 out of every 10. See, when I was growing up, it was 7 out of 10. Now it's 3 out of 10. And this is the world that my grandchildren are growing up in. And I don't know if it's going to go down, if it's going to go up. I believe it's going to go up. It's got to go up. We've got to reach a point where we say we need God in our lives. How can we continue rejecting Him and His grace and His goodness? I don't know. It may continue to go down before it ever goes up, but I know God's plan will endure. And so it is as we talk about God's grace and God's goodness, and people not finding time for God, for Jesus in their lives. One thing or another has taken the place of Jesus in their life. And let's look at this. It's not something unique to this time. It's from the very beginning of time, people have had no room for Jesus. You look in the very beginning in Luke chapter 2, verse 7 in particularly, but you know Luke chapter 2. There was a census, a tax being made, and Caesar Augustus had to tax all the world, it says. And every place goes to their hometown. And so Joseph goes to Bethlehem, and Mary, his espoused wife, is great with child, and they go to the inn. And they knock on the door, Do you have room? We've been searching everywhere. Now, I'm kind of adding to this, whether we've been searching everywhere, but that would be kind of implied with that because there was no place in the city for them. Everyone from all around had gone to their hometowns, and now it was just overpopulated with people coming back. And there's no room in the inn. And the innkeeper would say, I don't have room for Jesus. You might have heard about the third grade class that did this Christmas play, and they had done it 3 times. And it was that the innkeeper, the young boy playing the innkeeper, after the first 2 times, he was kind of made out to be the villain by the rest of his classmates. You turned away Jesus. You say there's no room in the inn. And so the third time it was, the knock came on the door. Joseph said, do you have room in the inn? And the innkeeper said, sure I do. You can have my room. Change it a little bit. But isn't that what ought to be said today? Sure there is. Do you have room in your heart for Jesus? Yes. You can have my heart, Jesus. There's room for you. It's not my heart, it's His heart. And from the very beginning of time when it is that we have no room for Jesus, and He spent His whole life like this. Let's look at a few scriptures. No room in the inn. Right? We all know that. What about no room in Bethlehem? In Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 13, or around Matthew chapter 2, that we read about the wise men coming to see Jesus. And they come to Jerusalem. They don't go to Bethlehem, but they come to Jerusalem. And Herod is there in Jerusalem. They're asking, where is he born King of the Jews? And they inquired the prophets of where this was. And they quoted the book of Micah. And they said, in Bethlehem he is. And so they go to Bethlehem. And as they go to Bethlehem, Herod says to them, you go to worship the king. And you come back and tell me where he is that I might go worship him also. But the wise men were warned, and they didn't go back to Herod. And Herod did not want to be dethroned. And so it was that Joseph was told that Herod was going to kill the children. He said, there's no room for you in Bethlehem. You've got to flee Bethlehem. You need to go to Egypt. Right. And so Mary and Joseph and Jesus leave Bethlehem and go to Egypt. He spends some time there in Egypt. It is that, as we know, that the scriptures say, out of Egypt I've called my son, and that was fulfilled with Mary and Joseph going to Egypt and then coming back. But it was, there was no room in the inn whenever he was born. We're going to a manger. A lowly birth, isn't it, for the King of Kings. But it was that he was there in the manger and he was born. And then, after his birth, God tells Mary and Joseph, you need to leave Bethlehem. And so they go to Egypt for a period of time. As they go in Egypt and they're raising Jesus, it comes that Herod dies and his son becomes the king there. In Bethlehem, they flee to Egypt, Matthew 2, verse 13. And then we read Matthew chapter 2, verse 22 and 23, as it was, that they find out that Herod dies. His son is going to take his place. And so as they're coming back, they don't come back to Bethlehem. They don't come back to Jerusalem because they might face persecution there also. And so they go to Nazareth. And when we think of Jesus, or when I think of Jesus, I think Jesus of Nazareth. Not Jesus of Egypt or Jesus of Bethlehem, but Jesus of Nazareth. And so they leave Bethlehem, go to Egypt, because we know that all the children under 2 years of age were killed by Herod. No room for Jesus there. He didn't want a king. He didn't want anyone usurping his throne or being heir to his throne. And so he said there's no room. In fact, I will kill all children just to get the right one. And so Mary and Joseph fled and they went to Egypt. Now, he's not going to be Jesus of Egypt, is he? But out of Egypt I've called my son. And so they go to Judea. In fact, went to Galilee. Galilee, you know, is the region north of Jerusalem. Judea is the place where most of the Jews dwelt. Judea. That's where Jerusalem is, the capital of the Jewish nation, in Jerusalem. And that's why the wise men went to Jerusalem. That's where the king ought to be. Ought to be out of Jerusalem. The temple is at Jerusalem. On the feast days, the Passover, as we talk about, all the people would come to the temple and they would worship and offer sacrifices to God. That's where the temple is. That's where the center of worship is. That's where the center of politics is in Jerusalem. But he didn't go to Jerusalem. That's where the king would be. But he didn't go there, lest he be killed. He went to Nazareth, about 60 miles north of Jerusalem. He was raised to be a Nazarene. And so he was there in the town of Nazareth. As he went from Judea to Galilee to Nazareth, because out of Egypt he left, we continue reading in Matthew 13. Now, Jesus began his ministry in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 with the Sermon on the Mount. But Matthew 13 is shortly after that. And it says that as he is preaching in Nazareth, we're in Matthew chapter 13. Turn over to Matthew chapter 13. And when we read about Jesus in Nazareth, and he began doing miracles, he began his ministry, he began doing wonderful things. He's now out to proclaim his public ministry. He's been private for 30 years, and now he's starting his public ministry. And where better, the Sermon on the Mount is just outside of the city of Nazareth, there by the seashore, there by the Sea of Galilee. And so he gives the Sermon on the Mount. And then as in Matthew chapter 13, he begins talking to others. It came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed. He came into his own country. Now, he'd been living there. He's at about the age of 30 now. He'd been living there for some time since he'd been called out of Egypt. People knew him as a young boy growing up. They knew his family. In fact, we're going to read about that. So when Jesus goes and begins his public ministry, he goes to those who know him best. But this is what it says. When he came into his own country, he taught them in the synagogue, insomuch as they were astonished. We're reading Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 53. They were astonished and said, "Whence has this man this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brethren James and Joseph and Simon and Judas and his sisters, are they not with us? When has this man these things?" Who does Jesus think he is to tell us these things? Who is, don't we know his father, we know his mother, we know his brothers, we know his sisters, we know him. Now who does he think he is? And they rejected him. Those that knew him the longest, those that knew him and watched him grow up and were with him all his life, said, "We have no room for you, Jesus." And this is what Jesus said. Verse 57, "A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and his own house." And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. It would seem to be that those that knew Jesus best, were closest with him, that watched him grow up, would receive him. But they didn't. There's no room for you, Jesus. We can't believe. We can't believe that you are the Messiah. We watched you grow up. You're the Messiah. And they rejected him. Not only in Nazareth, but whenever it was that Jesus left Galilee, he went across the Jordan River. Across the Jordan River is where the Gentiles were. And so he had gone to the Jews. He's gone to his own country. He's gone to his own people who watched him grow up. And they rejected him. Prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. And certainly Jesus was without honor with those that said, well, we know his mother and father and brothers and sisters. And who does he think he is? The Messiah? Oh, we just can't believe that. And so Jesus departed from them. In the land of the Gadarenes, we know that this is a Gentile nation. In particularly, we know this because they are tending pigs. If you know Jews and pigs don't associate with one another. And so you don't have that. Well, this is not a Jewish people that we're talking about with those raising the pigs. But it was in this area, the Gadarene is an area. Out in this area, there were two men that were possessed by demons. And they were crazy and they were wild and they were rejected by their countrymen. And they were isolated by themselves and they were just, as you read about them, that just demon possessed and everything you may think about that, how they lived and such. Jesus went to them, cast the demons out into the herd of swine, it says, the herd of pigs. And the pigs ran down and drowned themselves in the lake. And when that happened, it was that the people, instead of saying, well, who is this marvelous, wonderful man that can control demons and cast out demons? They said this about him. In Matthew chapter 8, particularly in verse 34, and behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus because Jesus was in the region of the area. The demon-possessed men did not live in the city, but they heard about this. They found them in the demon-possessed men. They found them in their own right mind. Instead of giving praise to God, they said this to Jesus. Behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they besought him that he would depart out of their coast. Jesus, we have no room for you here. He went to his own city where he was raised. They said, we have no room for you here. He goes across the river to the Gentiles. They said, we have no room for you here. In fact, it is when Jesus was born in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1 verse 1. John 1 verse 14 said the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We know that Jesus was born. He dwelt among us. But verse 11 says he came unto his own, and his own received him not. Saying that he came into his Jewish nation, his own. What did the Jews do with Jesus? We know that whenever he came into Jerusalem, the last week of his life, they proclaimed him and honored him as king. And just a few days later, they were in the halls of Pilate saying, crucify him. In effect saying, we have no room for Jesus in our life. Romans chapter 6 talks about living a new life. When we read Romans 6 and talks about that, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? He said, no, not in any way. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? And then verse 10 says, and he died unto sin once, but in that he liveth unto God. Likewise, we ourselves are to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. It's a great question, isn't it? Do you have room for Jesus today? All his life he faced rejection. He did have some who did turn toward him. He did have some who would say, you are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. You will be my Lord. You will be my King. I will be your disciple. I will follow you all the days of my life, and I'll follow you into heaven. What about you this morning? Do you have room for Jesus? Have you dedicated your life to him? Have you turned from the path of sin and turned toward the path of righteousness? Maybe this morning you need to make that choice. If you're not a Christian, why not? Why not? Do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? Those in his hometown didn't. They questioned that. In fact, they rejected him. You're not the Son of God. We saw you growing up. We know you, your brothers, your sisters, your mom and dad. You can't be the Son of God. There were even those who saw his mighty works and said, we don't have room for Jesus. Though you cast out demons, though you made these men who were once wild, you made them whole and in their right mind, Jesus, we have no room for you. The Jews rejected him as their king. Remember when Pilate put the sign? They would put what you were convicted of a sign on the cross. And Pilate put the King of the Jews. And the Jewish leaders went to Pilate and said, don't say he's the King of the Jews. Say, he says he's the King of the Jews. And Pilate said, what I've written, I've written. Is he King of your life? We offer the gospel invitation right now. Trust and obey. Do you trust him? And will you obey his word? If you will, won't you respond to the gospel invitation right now while we stand and while we sing?